Okay, next up, I'm going to talk a little bit about a proposal to phase out oil and gas production. And the first part of this is going to be about why we should do it. And the second part at the end is going to be how we might be able to do it. It's fairly tough. So let me get my PowerPoint up here. Okay. So this is what I'm going to talk about. First, the organization Stop Oil and Gas. Then there are two reports from the United Nations Environmental Program that I'll discuss that came out last year late. And then finally, how we might go about. Those two reports basically deal with why we should phase out oil and gas production. And then the last section of this presentation will be about how can we maybe do it. So Stop Oil and Gas is a California corporation, a nonprofit 501c4, a little different from the normal 501c3, because it does a lot of lobbying, and it's something we just set up recently. So it lobbies for the adoption of legislation to phase out oil and gas production by 2050. Pretty much all of the reports from the IPCC and the UNEP say we need to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So it's kind of logical to stop. Most of those emissions come from burning fossil fuels. It makes sense to stop producing fossil fuels. I mean, what are we going to do with them? Right now, the US government is seeing the problem. They don't have enough storage space for all the oil out there. And there's even like talk of a negative oil price because nobody can stash the stuff anywhere. That's ideally where we're going to be by 2050, where nobody's using oil. So what's the point of producing it? So we have a website at stopoilandgas.org. The Emissions Gap Report. This came out, this has been produced for several years now by the Stockholm Environmental Institute in conjunction with the UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program. And I have a URL on the screen there, kind of a long one. You can probably just Google Emissions Gap Report and get to the site as well. In fact, that's probably how I got there. But it documents the differences between the current level of emissions, and we're talking about global GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, again, mostly from burning fossil fuels, but the gap between our current emissions and the levels we need to cut them down to in order to comply with, well, the Paris Agreement, but also in order to get to the possibility that we may have only 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees of global warming. And the differences are pretty substantial. So I pretty much stole all the graphics from the report for this presentation. This slide shows on the left greenhouse gas emissions by country. You can kind of see China is the big one. They're building a lot of power plants, and their GHG emissions are increasing a lot. The US is the second line down there. We're kind of motoring along at more or less the same, maybe going down a little bit. And the third line down is the EU, which is doing better than we are in gradually reducing its emissions. Below that, India is going up. India is also building a lot of power plants, coal-fired power plants. And then we get to, Russia and such that are relatively small. On the right, we see the per capita emissions. And there's the big shame of the US at the top, how much more greenhouse gases we emit per person than anybody else. And it's been going down. I mean, it's partly because our energy intensity is reducing. We're getting a little more efficient, but of course our population still grows a little bit, and we're not doing that much to reduce it. Next level there is Russia, which is not that important because it's small. It doesn't have that big an economy. You can see on the left side, the Russian emissions aren't super high. And then you kind of go down to lower per capita emissions for China and Japan and so on. The sort of troubling one is that China, China per capita is going up. That's really bad. And of course, they have a really big population. So here are possible scenarios for the future of these emissions. What we have is a graph on the left. You can see from 2015 to 2030. This is, I'm not quite sure what the 2005 policy scenario is at the top. The current policy scenario is sort of what we're doing now. This is the trajectory. That blue line is the trajectory we're on, right now if we don't do anything else. The lines below that are the unconditional NDC scenario and the conditional NDC scenario. So NDCs, I've gotten a couple people telling me on the Q&A, watch out for these acronyms. People don't know what they are. So NDC is the nationally determined contribution. It's basically the promise made under the Paris Agreement by each country as for its, how it will reduce emissions in the future. And of course, at this point, I believe all the countries are under that agreement. So the unconditional one is like, we promise to do this no matter what. And the conditional one is, well, if this thing happens, then we'll reduce it this much. But you can see both of those are way, way higher than what we can afford, because below that, we've got the 2.5 degree range and the 1.8 degree range and the 1.5 degree range. Those three lines are kind of projections of where we need to go to get to those levels of kind of final greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere that we can stand. So the 2 degree range has a line going down to about 42 gigatons per year. And the blue haze around it, the kind of range, if you will, is like a range of uncertainty. We don't know. It's somewhere in that blue area where the real line is, but we don't know because we're not completely sure, because the modeling, these models are really, really complex, and they have some variability, and there are several of them that have different results. So you can see, to get to 2 degrees, let alone 1.8 or 1.5 degrees, excuse me, we need to do a lot more than we're doing right now. We're just nowhere near where we need to be in this. And the gaps at the right are essentially gaps between the emissions we are having now and the emissions reductions we need to have a 1.5 degree world when all is said and done. This is an allied graphic. Actually, it was on the same page in the Emissions Gap Report, but it goes out to 2050 and sort of projects out. The stuff we saw on the screen before is in that little blue box on the left. And then, going up to 2030, and then there are projections going out to 2050. And you can see, especially for 1.5, we need to get down very low. The current IPCC calls for essentially net zero emissions in 2050. This is saying we can have a little bit more than that, but I mean, the difference between those things at this point is academic, since we're nowhere near getting to any of these ranges. It's just, we're not doing this at all. So that's the Emissions Gap Report, is the difference between what we're emitting actually now and what we're projected to emit, and where we need to go to have a decent world that's not totally affected by climate change, a lot more than it is now. We're in a 1 degree world right now, and we already see lots of effects. The other report is this Production Gap Report, and this is a new thing from SEI and UNEP. The first one came out in November 2019, and it's sort of parallel, but instead of documenting the discrepancy between the emissions and where we ought to be, it applies that same type of analysis to oil and gas and coal production. And the point is, if we're extracting fossil fuels, we're going to burn them. So we need, while we reduce our emissions, to reduce our production of fossil fuels. And this is the graph on the production gap. So what we see is the top red line is countries' production plans and projections. Now, most countries have an agency, I think it's the EIA in the US, that keep track of energy and energy sources and usage, and they have projections and plans that help the government do its planning. So this red line is based on government's own plans. They're saying this is kind of a summary of what the governments have said they will do, what they're planning to do. The gold line just below that is the production that would be implied by the pledges, the Paris agreements by countries to reduce their GHG emissions, and it's lower. I mean, you produce less. But the problem is it's so much higher than where we need to go. The production consistent with 2 degrees and with 1 degree, you can see is ramping down well towards zero, at least toward much lower levels than we have now. And we're not doing anything like that at all. We're not planning to do anything like that. And that's a big problem. Here is the same data broken out by coal, oil, and gas. This is, again, worldwide. This is global data. The top line for coal shows coal going pretty flat. And what's happening, as we'll see, it's being reduced a lot in the US, but not in China and India. Oil is going up, and gas is really going up, especially in the US, as we'll see. But these kind of break out, they all have the same import. You know, these graphs all show that what we're extracting in terms of fossil fuels is way more than we can afford to keep extracting if we're gonna not have a 10°C increase in our temperature by 2100. Here is a country-based analysis of the same sort of data. The left, you can see China is all coal, you know, virtually, which is bad because, of course, coal emits more greenhouse gases per kilowatt hour produced than other fuels for electricity. This is mostly electric power production in China. US is pretty balanced. Russia, we don't care, they're too small. Saudi Arabia is all oil. You know, this is production, right? This is actually Russia. I'm sorry, I go back to Russia. We do care because Russia is a big oil and gas producer. It doesn't use this, it doesn't burn all this stuff itself, but it sells it to, well, countries in the EU mostly, but, you know, outside Russia is where it's burned. You know, just as an aside, there's been a tradition to account for greenhouse gases based on where the emissions, where the fossil fuels are burned, where the emissions occur. But this production report suggests that another accounting is look for where these things are extracted. That's another way of looking at it. India, a lot of coal. Australia and Indonesia, I think they're all building coal plants. India certainly is. And then here are the national plans summed up for fossil fuel production, expressed in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, gigatons per year. You know, China, you know, roughly the same, US sort of the same. What's alarming to me on this is kind of the rest of the world at the top. A lot of this is developing countries, which are going to need to increase their GHGs. I mean, they need to develop their economies somewhat, and they need energy to do it. So we need to push them in the direction of renewables. Here's US government outlook for the specific types of fossil fuels. You can see coal is down. Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign has had a lot of success in closing coal-fired power plants. That's one of the important contributors to this. But we still have, I think, 200 and some coal plants open in the United States, spewing out GHGs and other pollution. Oil obviously has gone up. You can see it's kind of in the US again. This is United States government outlook. Oil is kind of leveling off, but it needs to go down. And on the right, this is the big bad one right now, is gas. I mean, we've had this big increase in natural gas production in the US because of the shale gas and fracking in the, well, a little bit in California, but mostly in the Midwest. And that's made gas really cheap, and that production's going up. So here's some steps that already have been taken in places to phase out oil and gas production. You know, France is a pretty good one here. The kind of steps in doing this are, first, you stop exploring for new resources. You know, no more looking for oil or gas like we're doing in the Arctic Refuge right now, because we have enough reserves that if we burned them all, we'd be in big trouble global warming wise. We can't afford to burn the fossil fuels we already know about. So what's the point of exploring for more? The second step would be to curtail, to say no new drilling permits. That would be a nice thing to do. We're just going to use the existing oil. The third step would be cut down the production from, or stop producing from wells that are close enough to people, like within 2,500 feet of them, that harm their health. I mean, these oil wells put out all kinds of pollution that gets, you know, other kinds of pollution in the air. You know, they don't do GHG emissions themselves directly, but they put other, you know, bad things in the air, which is bad for people's health when they live near there. And of course, the fourth step would be just, let's phase out oil and gas production. So France has kind of done that, but there's not much oil and gas produced actually in France. So it's more of you know, kind of a nice thing that they've done policy-wise, but it's not super effective. And in most other countries, they've kind of made steps in the direction, like Costa Rica. A moratorium on exploration and exploitation doesn't mean that they're closing all the existing oil wells. So what's wrong with us just regulating everything from the demand side? What's wrong with us just saying, well, we're going to forget about the production side, because when we eventually get to replacing all our cars with electric cars, when we reduce the demand, then there's not going to be any more fossil fuel production, because they're not going to have any place to sell it. Well, one of the problems is that by planning, our government is actively planning to produce more oil than is consistent with a reasonable response to global warming. And by doing that, they send a signal to the business community and to everybody else that we're not really serious about this. We're going to have this lip service of doing this and that, but we're not really going to solve the problem. So that signal is very important. And also just adding more fossil fuel infrastructure at a time like this. We keep building more pipelines for natural gas, and they're really expensive, and they're going to be stranded assets. What's going to happen is 10 years from now, when we say we can't use natural gas anymore at all, those pipelines are going to be useless, and the accountants are going to have to write off like the last 2/3 of the costs for those. It's going to be a big expense. So we shouldn't be building that infrastructure. We should be spending that money on something else, like building more renewable, you know, wind farms and solar panels and so on. And also the government failing to take seriously, you know, to plan for ramping down oil and gas sends a signal to people that they're not going to need to be prepared for the changes that are coming. Changes, some of which are listed here. I mean, we've got to get all the gasoline vehicles off the street by 2050, or pretty, you know, like almost all of them. And we've got to replace all our oil and gas heating in our houses with electric heating or something else by 2050. That's a big change. You know, I used to live in Boston where it was oil. And even here in California, I have natural gas in my house. That thing has to come off the roof, and you know, people just aren't aware of that. And then obviously we need to keep replacing coal and gas power plants with renewable energy sources. So all of that is getting kind of downplayed by the government's kind of complicity in let's go ahead and keep producing oil and gas. Just a kind of background on why we need to stop burning fossil fuels. Basically, the temperature, the average temperature will continue to increase as long as we keep putting more GHGs, greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere. So we need to stop doing that. And it's the concentration of GHGs in the atmosphere at the point where we completely stop doing that that will determine how much global warming we have. And whatever the level that is, it's going to last for hundreds of years, because at least most of it will last, because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for a really long time, for hundreds or thousands of years. And burning fossil fuels is the leading cause of those emissions. We need to stop that. The oil and gas companies are pointing to CO2 removal technologies as their future, but the problem is there's nothing that's been proven to work on the scale that we would need. What we'd like is a nice little box we can plug in outside that would pull CO2 out of the air and put it into the ground, or break it apart into oxygen and carbon, like diamonds or something on the side. We don't know how to build that machine, and actually that second machine is thermodynamically impossible. Given that there's no reliable way to remove carbon dioxide, something we can depend on, we should follow what they would do in Europe a little bit, which is the precautionary principle. We should err on the side of protecting our planet and protecting our environment instead of protecting business, is what we're mostly doing right now. So Stop Oil and Gas's aspirational goal is basically phase out oil and gas production worldwide by 2050. Between us, we don't really need to get completely down to zero, because there'll be some things that we need a little bit of fossil fuels for. But we also have a lot of areas where we need a lot of fossil fuels, like cement production, where we need to do research as intensively as we can to figure out how we're going to get by without using them for that. The US Congress could just phase out oil and gas production under the Commerce Clause if it wanted to, but there's no way, well, especially now, I mean, there's no chance in getting that through the US Senate right now. That's like the opposite of anything they do, and I doubt the House would even vote for it. We can't expect action at the federal level here on this. And we also can't really expect action from the California legislature on that. California is, here's the figure we were talking about earlier, the 7th largest oil producing state in the US. So it's like a fraction of Texas, but it does have a fair amount of oil production. A lot of it's in Kern County, just north of LA County. I drove back from San Luis Obispo a couple months ago, and huge oil fields, just hundreds and hundreds of oil derricks up there. We even have some of them in the city of Los Angeles. But the oil and gas industry employs a lot of workers and contributes $66 billion to the California GDP. So, it's going to be a fight. It has economic consequences to make that go away. The California legislature could just phase it out. They could say, we're going to stop it by 2045, which is the date when the governor's order has said we're going to get to net zero, or they could say we're going to stop it by 2050. But the oil and gas, I spent a day or two up in Sacramento recently talking to legislative staffers, and they say, no way the legislature is ever doing this, because the oil and gas industry, kind of allied with the labor unions, is too strong. And the governor is doing some good stuff now. Starting in November 2019, he put out a little range of measures sort of heading in the direction. There's a study for how we might phase out oil and gas. That's just a study. There's a new statute that gives the oil and gas agency that regulates oil and gas production, CalGEM, the right to use health issues in adopting regulations. And there's some hope that they might use that to enact a 2,500-foot setback just through regulations without it going through the legislature. But in terms of actually phasing out oil and gas production, the governor doesn't have the power to just do it, because there are a lot of statutes in the code. So we're proposing an initiative. We can pass a statute by initiative in California. We plan to introduce a ballot measure for the 2022 election that would basically require a linear ramp down of oil and gas production by each oil producer. And so if, you know, the challenge for us is we can easily draft it, but we need something like 600,000 signatures to get it on the ballot, and that'll be the hard thing. But we won't do it until after this next 2020 election. The hard part is this just transition for oil and gas. I'm going to skip ahead. We don't want to just phase it out and leave the oil workers out in the dark. And we don't want to leave the cities that depend on those revenues, like probably Bakersfield, totally without any recourse after this is done. So designing this is the hard part, and that's the thing we're going to be thinking about. And we'll kind of piggyback. The governor is having workshops with oil workers to talk about the health regulations from CalGEM, and apparently a lot of those are attended well by oil workers, and that's probably a good way to get their input on how to do this. But we do envision like a large fund that will provide for retraining and job transition payments. I'm almost out of time, so last slide is, why should we do this in California? Well, we're a leader in fighting climate change, as Nicole kind of took you through earlier today. So a whole sequence of things culminating in Governor Brown's order requiring the state to become carbon neutral by 2045. We're the largest oil producing state where the voters might approve such a thing. Oil production here is significant, but it's only 3% of the GDP. And, you know, I hate to put it this way, but we're wealthy enough, we're a leader in climate change. We should set the example for the world. This would be a world-changing thing if we can manage to do it. It would say to everybody, you know, we're really serious about this. We're willing to take our steps, that even if it will hurt us economically somewhat, we're doing it in a smart way. We're doing a just way so that we don't put the transition on the back of all the workers, but it's really important that we do it. So that's my time. I can't get to your questions because I'm out of time, but I thank you.